For 40 years, my mother never once said the words "I love you." Not on my birthdays. Not when I graduated. Not when I called her crying after my divorce. Or when I stood outside her house in the rain just wanting to hear her voice soften, even for a second. She would say hello. She would ask if I had eaten. She would tell me to drive safe. But those 3 words never came. I used to think maybe she just wasn't built that way, that some mothers show love through actions instead of words. I told myself that story for 4 decades, because the alternative was too painful to sit with. And then one afternoon, a phone rang in her kitchen, and everything I believed about my mother, about our silence, about the shape of her heart, was about to be rewritten in a way I never saw coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and this is the story of my mother, Eleanor Whitfield, a woman I spent my whole life trying to reach. I want to take you back to the last time I heard her voice, because that moment will make sense of everything that follows. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and I was standing in a hospital hallway holding a phone that felt heavier than it should have. On the other end was a nurse, not my mother, telling me it was time to come say goodbye. I remember the fluorescent lights humming above me, the smell of antiseptic, the strange stillness of a building where so many endings happen quietly, without anyone outside ever knowing. I remember thinking, this cannot be how it ends, not after everything that had just started to change between us. 3 weeks earlier, my mother had said something to me on the phone that stopped me cold. She said, "You know I care for you, Daniel." Just like that, plain and unguarded, spoken by a woman who had spent my entire childhood treating affection like a language she had never learned to speak. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for almost 20 minutes after that call, not moving, not starting the engine, just replaying those words over and over, trying to understand what had shifted inside her and why now. After everything, after all the years of silence between us, she had finally chosen to say them. I grew up in where silence wasn't the absence of something, it was the architecture the whole household was built on. I was raised in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, called Grovemont, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's cars before they knew each other's names, where the tallest building downtown was the grain elevator and the biggest event of the year was a county fair that shut down Main Street for 3 days every August. We lived in a modest brick house on a street called Larch Avenue, the kind of house with a screen door that slammed shut on its own and a kitchen window that looked out over a chain-link fence and the neighbor's vegetable garden. My father, whose name was Robert, worked at a machine parts plant on the edge of town for most of my early childhood, and my mother stayed home in those years, at least officially, though staying home never seemed to mean resting. She was always doing something, canning vegetables, mending clothes, scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees long after Claire and I were asleep. Even then, before everything fell apart, she was not a woman who talked much. My father was the one who filled our house with noise, laughter at the dinner table, arguments that echoed through the thin walls, and when he left, it wasn't just a person who disappeared from our house, it was the sound of it. I don't remember the day my father left with any real clarity, only fragments, a suitcase by the front door, my mother standing very still in the hallway, her arms crossed in a way that made her look smaller than she actually was, Claire crying in the bedroom we shared a wall with, and me, 6 years old, standing at the top of the stairs not fully understanding what was happening, only understanding that something had ended. I learned much later, as an adult, some of the details my mother had kept from us as children, that my father had been struggling with drinking for years before he left, that there had been a woman in a neighboring town, that the plant had let him go twice for missing shifts before he finally stopped trying to hide any of it. My mother never spoke badly of him to us growing up, not once, which I understand now took a kind of restraint I couldn't have appreciated as a child. She simply absorbed the whole collapse of our family quietly and set about the business of keeping us fed and housed, because that, to her, was what a mother did, whatever else was happening underneath. After my father left, my mother took a job waiting tables at a diner called Verna's on Route 9, a squat building with a flickering sign and booths upholstered in cracked red vinyl. The kind of place where the coffee was always burnt by 10 in the morning and the regulars tipped in loose change. She worked the early shift, 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, on her feet the entire time, carrying plates and refilling coffee for truck drivers and factory workers who barely looked up from their newspapers. In the evenings, she cleaned office buildings downtown, vacuuming carpets and emptying trash cans in rooms that had been occupied by people who earned in a day what she earned in a month. She would come home close to midnight smelling of bleach and burnt coffee, and by the time I woke for school, she was already gone again, off to the diner before sunrise. I grew up mostly raised by silence and routine, a house that ran on schedules instead of conversation, because conversation required energy my mother simply did not have left to give. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being loved by someone who is too exhausted to show it. And I don't think I understood that as a child. I only understood the absence itself. I remember bringing home a spelling test with a gold star on it when I was 8 years old, running through the front door so excited I nearly tripped over the frayed edge of the hallway rug, and finding my mother asleep sitting upright at the kitchen table, her uniform still on, a cup of cold coffee in front of her. I stood there for a long moment deciding whether to wake her, and eventually I didn't. I put the test in a drawer in my room instead, and I don't believe she ever saw it. That drawer became, over the years, a kind of private archive, report cards, certificates, a letter accepting me into a state university on a partial scholarship, all of it collected quietly, waiting for a moment of recognition that never quite arrived. I want to tell you about a specific Christmas, because I think it explains more about my mother than almost anything else I could describe. I was 11 years old, and money that year was tighter than usual. The diner had cut her hours after a change in ownership, and I remember overhearing her on the phone with Claire's school about a fundraiser fee she couldn't quite cover. On Christmas morning, there were exactly 2 presents under a small artificial tree we reused every year, one for me and one for Claire, both wrapped in newspaper because we had run out of wrapping paper and she hadn't been able to justify buying more. Mine was a baseball glove, used, the leather already broken in by someone else's hand, purchased secondhand from a classified ad in the local paper. I remember feeling a flicker of disappointment I was immediately ashamed of. And then I remember watching my mother's face as I opened it, the careful, guarded hope in her expression, and I understood, even at 11, that this glove had cost her something significant, not in dollars, but in the quiet humiliation of buying secondhand for her son when other mothers in town could afford new. She never explained any of that to me. She simply watched me put the glove on, and when I said thank you, she nodded once and went to start breakfast. That nod, I would learn, was the closest thing to a full sentence of affection my mother generally allowed herself. My sister Claire was 4 years older than me, and she found her own way of coping with our mother's exhaustion, throwing herself into after-school jobs and eventually leaving for college 2 states away the moment she turned 18, partly for the scholarship, and partly, I think, to put real distance between herself and a house that had never quite recovered its warmth after our father left. I stayed closer to home longer than she did, partly out of loyalty, partly, I think now, because some part of me was still hoping that if I stayed close enough, long enough, my mother would eventually find the words I was waiting for. She never did. Not when I made the honor roll 3 years running. Not when I got my first job at 17, stocking shelves at a hardware store on the edge of town, coming home each night to hand her a folded envelope of cash toward the electric bill, which she would take with a small nod and nothing more. I used to tell myself that nod was enough. I told myself that story for a very long time. There was a man named Walter who managed that hardware store, an older man with a slow way of talking and an even slower way of judging people, who became something like a mentor to me during those teenage years, teaching me how to read a ledger, how to talk to customers, how to notice when inventory numbers didn't add up, and what that usually meant. Walter used to tell me I had a mind for business long before I believed it myself, and looking back, I think he filled a gap in my life that I didn't fully recognize at the time, the gap my father had left and my mother's exhaustion couldn't reach. I never told my mother how much those afternoons at the hardware store meant to me, the quiet encouragement, the sense that someone was paying attention to what I was becoming. I'm not sure she ever asked. I left Grovemont at 18 for a state university 2 hours away, studying business on financial aid and working nights at a call center to cover what the aid didn't. My mother didn't come to my graduation. She said she couldn't get the day off from the cleaning company, and I believed her, because it was probably true, and because believing anything else would have required confronting a version of her I wasn't ready to face. I stood on that stage in a rented gown, scanning the crowd out of some old, stubborn habit, and when I didn't find her face among the rows of parents, I told myself it didn't matter, the same way I had told myself 100 small disappointments didn't matter over the years, stacking them quietly somewhere I wouldn't have to look at them directly. I built my 20s on a quiet, restless ambition that I now understand was never really about business at all. It was about proving something to a woman who rarely looked up long enough to notice. I took a job at a small logistics company after graduation, learned everything I could about supply chains and distribution, worked my way from an entry-level coordinator role into a regional operations position within 3 years. I called my mother during that period more than I probably should have, not asking for money. I never asked her for money, but asking, I think, for some kind of encouragement I didn't yet know how to ask for directly. She would listen, mostly in silence, and at the end of the call she would usually say something practical. Make sure you're eating, don't forget to sleep, and then the call would end, and I would sit in my small apartment feeling both loved and entirely unseen at the same time, a contradiction I carried for years without ever fully naming it. At 26, I left that logistics company and leased a single rented office above a hardware store, not unlike the one I had stocked shelves in as a teenager, and started a company of my own, a regional freight coordination business built on a simple idea that small manufacturers were being overcharged and underserved by the large logistics firms that dominated the industry, and that there was room for something smaller, faster, and more honest. The early years of that company nearly broke me. I want to be honest about that, because the story that gets told about people who eventually succeed often skips over the years that almost destroyed them. I slept on a cot in that office more nights than I can count, surviving on gas station coffee and whatever I could afford at the diner 2 doors down. I lost 2 business partners in the first 18 months, both of whom told me, not unkindly, that I was chasing something unreasonable, that the margins were too thin, the competition too established. I remember a specific week, 8 months into the company's life, when I had exactly $1,100 in the business account and a payroll obligation to 2 employees that came to just over $1,300, and I sat in that rented office at 2 in the morning trying to figure out which bill to delay, which promised to break first. I called my mother during that week, though I didn't tell her the real reason. I asked her, almost offhandedly, how she had managed those years after my father left, how she had kept going when the math never seemed to work in her favor. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me something I had never heard her say before, that some weeks she hadn't eaten dinner so that Claire and I could have full plates, that she had learned to treat hunger as something to simply wait out until morning. I didn't tell her why I was asking. I hung up the phone that night and sat with a kind of shame and determination I still can't fully describe. And the next morning, I found a way to make the payroll work, a small consulting contract I had been putting off pursuing because I thought it was beneath the company's ambitions. It wasn't beneath anything. It kept us alive for another 6 weeks, long enough for a larger contract to come through. It took nearly a decade, but the company grew, slowly, and then suddenly, the way these things sometimes do. By my late 30s, what had started as a single rented office had become a mid-sized logistics and distribution firm with contracts across 4 states and a staff of over 200 people. By my late 40s, it had grown into something significant enough to attract national attention, acquisitions, partnerships, eventually a valuation that still felt unreal to me even as I watched it happen on paper. I married once during those years, in my mid-30s, to a woman named Rebecca, a marriage that lasted 6 years before ending quietly and without much bitterness, both of us realizing somewhere along the way that the version of me building a company from a cot in a rented office had very little room left over for a marriage that needed tending. My mother met Rebecca exactly twice in 6 years. She liked her, I think, in the reserved way she liked most people, but she never asked about the marriage struggling, never seemed to notice, or if she noticed, she never said. Through all of it, my relationship with my mother remained largely unchanged. I called her every Sunday, a habit I never broke even during the busiest years of the company's growth. She asked if I was eating. I told her about milestones in careful, understated language, afraid, I think, of sounding like I was bragging to a woman who had scrubbed office floors to keep a roof over our heads. She rarely asked follow-up questions. I stopped expecting her to. Claire and I talked about it sometimes, on the rare occasions we saw each other, both of us circling the same unspoken question without ever quite landing on it directly, whether our mother was capable of the kind of warmth we both still, quietly, in some stubborn corner of ourselves, hoped for. By the time I turned 52, I had built something I never could have imagined as that boy on Larch Avenue with a spelling test hidden in a drawer. And somewhere in the years of success, a quieter idea had been forming in me, one I never discussed with my mother, or with Claire, or with almost anyone outside a small circle of advisors. I wanted to give a significant portion of what I had built back to towns like Grovemont, to fund medical research, and to support working single mothers, women like mine, who spent their lives exhausted and unseen while raising children who wouldn't understand the full weight of that sacrifice until decades later. I met with attorneys and foundation consultants for the better part of a year, structuring what would eventually become a $200 million gift, quietly, methodically, never intending for it to become public in the way that it eventually did. I named the foundation after Verna's Diner, of all things, calling it the Route 9 Foundation. A small private joke I planned to explain to my mother once the paperwork was finalized, once I had the chance to tell her myself. The paperwork was filed on a Thursday in early October. I remember the date because I had planned to tell my mother myself, in person, the following weekend, before anyone else could. I wanted her to hear it from me first. Wanted to watch her face when she understood what I was doing and why. Wanted, perhaps, one last chance to see something register in her expression that I had been waiting my entire life to see. But a local reporter in Columbus picked up the story before that weekend arrived, connecting the foundation's name to Route 9, to Grovemont, to the diner that had somehow, against every odd, still been standing in some form, now a different business but the same building. Within days, it had reached regional news. Within a week, national outlets had picked it up, and the story of a boy from a small brick house on Larch Avenue giving away $200 million to towns just like it had become, briefly, impossible to avoid. My face on morning shows I never expected to appear on, my childhood photographs, sourced from old yearbooks, circulating in ways that felt both flattering and strangely invasive. I didn't call to tell her myself, in the end. I have wondered many times since then why I let the moment slip away from me, whether some old wound made me hesitate, whether some part of me wanted to see if she would find out on her own and reach for me without being prompted, the way I had spent 40 years wishing she would. She found out from a neighbor, a woman named Patricia who had lived 2 doors down from us since before I was born, who saw my name on the evening news and walked across the street still in her house, slippers to knock on my mother's door, and ask if it was really her son they were talking about. My mother called me that same night, and for the first time in my adult life, her voice sounded different, unsteady in a way I had never once heard from her in 52 years. She asked if it was true, and when I told her it was, there was a long pause on the line, long enough that I genuinely thought the call had dropped. And then she said the four words that changed everything between us, the words I had waited my entire life to hear. I want to pause here and tell you what that phone call actually sounded like, because I've replayed it so many times since that I know every second of it by heart. After she said those words, there was another long silence, and I remember not knowing what to say back, my throat tight, my hand gripping the phone so hard my knuckles ached. I finally managed to say I love you too, Mom, and she made a small sound on the other end, something between a laugh and a cry, and then she asked me, almost shyly, if the foundation really had my grandmother's maiden name buried somewhere in the paperwork, a detail I had included quietly as a private tribute she wasn't supposed to have noticed yet. I told her it did, and she was quiet again. And then she said, "You always were paying more attention than any of us gave you credit for." It was, I think, the closest she had ever come to an apology. In the days that followed, something in my mother seemed to soften in ways I couldn't have predicted. She called more often, sometimes twice in a week, which for her was unprecedented. She asked questions about my life she had never asked before, wanted to know about my mornings, my worries, the small, ordinary details of my days that she had never once shown interest in throughout my childhood or my adult life. She asked about Rebecca, about the marriage, gently, without judgment, a conversation we had never once had while I was actually going through the divorce. She asked what Grovemont looked like to me now, whether I still thought about Verna's Diner, whether I remembered the sound the screen door made on Larch Avenue. Part of me wanted to simply accept this new version of her without question, to let myself finally have the mother I had spent decades wishing for. But another part of me, quieter and harder to ignore, kept asking why now. Why, after 40 years of silence, had $200 million been the thing that finally unlocked her voice? I wasn't sure I wanted the answer, but I knew I needed it. I decided to drive out to Grovemont that following weekend, something I hadn't done spontaneously in years. My mother greeted me at the door in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than any I could remember from my childhood, her arms thinner than I remembered, her grip somehow stronger. We sat at the same kitchen table where I used to do homework while she worked double shifts, and for the first time, she asked me to tell her everything, the whole story of how the company started, the failures before the successes, the nights I nearly gave up in that rented office above the hardware store, the week I had $1,100 and a payroll I couldn't meet. When I mentioned that week, she went quiet for a long moment, and then told me she remembered exactly which weeks in her own life had felt like that, more of them than she wanted to count. I found myself talking for hours, and she listened the way I had always wanted her to listen, fully present, asking questions, laughing at the right moments, her hand occasionally resting on mine across the table. It should have felt like healing, uncomplicated, and overdue. Instead, underneath the warmth, I kept noticing something else, a kind of urgency in the way she held onto my hand, as if she were trying to make up for lost time she somehow already knew she didn't have. My sister Claire noticed it too. She called me a few days after my visit, her voice tight with a mixture of relief and suspicion that I understood completely, because I felt the same contradiction myself. She said Mom had been different with her as well, warmer, more open on the phone than she had been in years, but also strangely focused on the past, bringing up memories neither of us had discussed in decades, asking Claire if she remembered a summer trip to a lake when Claire was small, a detail Claire barely remembered herself, and asking, more than once, whether Claire had forgiven her for the years she felt she had failed us both. Claire asked me directly if I thought our mother's sudden change had anything to do with the money, and I didn't have an honest answer for her. Part of me wanted to believe our mother was simply capable of change, that people could soften with age and circumstance, and the sudden visibility of a life well lived. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime cataloging every small silence, wondered if something else was happening beneath the surface, something neither of us had been told. Over the following weeks, I made the drive to Grovemont almost every Saturday, something I hadn't done consistently since I was in my 20s. Each visit revealed a little more of this new version of my mother, a woman who wanted to sit on the porch and talk until the streetlights came on, a woman who pulled out old photographs I never knew she'd kept, faded pictures of me as a toddler on the front steps of the Larch Avenue house, of Claire and me at Verna's diner on a rare Sunday off, my mother young and unguarded in a way I had never once seen her in person. She began telling me stories about her own childhood, about her mother, my grandmother, a woman who had died before I was born, a woman Eleanor described as even more distant than she herself had been, a woman who had raised 4 children through the Depression on a farm outside Zanesville and never once, as far as Eleanor could remember, said the words "I love you" either. I started to understand, slowly, that I was looking at the end of a long line, a kind of inheritance passed silently from mother to daughter to son, none of them cruel, all of them simply unequipped with a language none of them had ever been taught. Still, the urgency in her didn't fade, it deepened. She began giving away small things during those visits, a ring that had belonged to her own mother, a set of dishes she said she wanted me to have, while she could still tell me the story behind them, an old recipe box with cards written in handwriting from 3 generations back. I told myself these were simply the acts of a woman finally comfortable enough, finally secure enough, to be generous and sentimental after a lifetime of scarcity. I didn't want to consider the other explanation sitting quietly underneath every visit, the explanation that would eventually rearrange everything I thought I understood about the timing of her sudden warmth, about why $200 million on the evening news had been the catalyst for a change that, I would later learn, had almost nothing to do with money at all. There was one Saturday in late November I want to describe in particular because it stayed with me more than any other. We drove out together to the old hardware store where I had worked as a teenager, now a different business entirely, a small insurance office, but the building itself unchanged. My mother stood outside it for a long time, looking up at the sign, and told me she used to walk past that store on her way to Verna's shift and see me through the window stocking shelves, and that she used to feel, even then, a pride she never knew how to say out loud. I asked her why she never told me, and she was quiet for a long moment before saying that in her family, pride spoken out loud was considered a kind of arrogance, that the women before her had taught her to keep it folded up small, tucked away where it couldn't be seen, and that she had simply never learned another way to carry it until it was almost too late to unfold it at all. The truth came out on a rainy afternoon in early December, almost 2 months after that first phone call, on a Saturday when Claire happened to be traveling and I had come to Grovemont alone. My mother had asked me specifically to come without her, which should have told me something before I even arrived. She was sitting in the same chair by the window where she used to fold laundry while the evening news played quietly in the background, and when I walked in, she asked me to sit down before I had even taken off my coat. She told me she had been diagnosed the previous spring, months before my gift ever made headlines, with a condition her doctors had been honest with her about from the very beginning, a diagnosis with a timeline she had chosen not to share with either of her children. She hadn't told Claire. She hadn't told me. She said she had spent the entire summer alone with that news, sitting in that same chair by the window, thinking about the life she had lived, about the way she had failed to say the things that mattered most, and that watching my name appear on the evening news that October night hadn't created her feelings toward me. It had simply given her the courage to finally speak them out loud before she ran out of time to say them at all. I asked her, my voice barely steady, why she hadn't told us sooner, back in the spring when she first knew. She said she had spent months trying to protect us the only way she knew how, by carrying the weight alone. the same way she had carried the weight of my father leaving, the same way she had carried 2 jobs and an empty refrigerator some weeks without ever once complaining to Claire or me about it. She said that instinct, to absorb pain quietly rather than hand it to her children, had defined nearly every decision she'd made as a mother, for better and for worse, and that she understood now, looking back, how much that same instinct had cost all of us in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with words she should have said decades earlier. I sat with that for a long time after she told me, longer than I think she expected me to. 40 years of silence, and it turned out the money had never truly been the reason for her sudden warmth. It had only been the moment she finally allowed herself to stop protecting me from a fear she had carried alone for months. The fear of leaving this world and being remembered as a mother who never once said the words her son had needed to hear. She told me she had always loved me, in every version of herself, even the exhausted, silent version who worked 2 jobs and forgot to look up from a cold cup of coffee at a kitchen table. She said love, for her, had always been a quiet, practical thing, keeping a roof over our heads, keeping food on the table, folding laundry late into the night, and that somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that was enough, until this past year, until her diagnosis forced her to understand it wasn't, until she finally understood that I had spent my whole life waiting for words she had assumed, wrongly, that I already knew. Those 3 weeks between her confession and that final hospital hallway became the most honest period of our entire relationship, more honest than the previous 52 years combined. We talked every single day, sometimes for hours. She asked about my failures now instead of only my successes, wanted to understand the boy who had grown into the man standing in front of her, wanted to know what it had actually felt like sleeping on a cot above that hardware store, whether I had ever considered giving up entirely. I brought her photographs from my childhood she had never seen developed, sitting in a shoebox in my own attic for decades. And she told me stories about my father I had never heard before, about the years before he left, about the arguments that preceded his leaving, about her own mother, who had been just as silent with her as she had been with me and Claire. I began to understand, in those 3 weeks, that her silence had never been cruelty. It was inheritance, a language of restraint passed down through generations of women who had never once been taught how to say the thing they felt most deeply, even when they felt it entirely. Claire flew in during the second of those 3 weeks, and the 3 of us spent an entire Sunday together in a way we hadn't in decades, sitting in the small backyard on Larch Avenue, my mother in a folding chair wrapped in a blanket despite the mild weather, insisting she wanted to be outside one more time before winter set in fully. She told stories that afternoon I had never heard, about meeting my father at a county fair dance when she was 19, about the year before Claire was born when she still believed the marriage might work out, about a version of herself that existed before exhaustion had worn her down into the quiet, guarded woman I had known my entire life. Claire cried more than once that afternoon, and so did I, and my mother, uncharacteristically, let herself cry too, no longer holding herself at the careful distance she had maintained our entire lives. It was, I think, the only time in my life I saw all 3 of us fully present with each other at the same time, without any of the old walls standing between us. On the night the nurse called me, I drove to the hospital faster than I should have, running every red light between my house and hers, my hands unsteady on the wheel in a way they hadn't been since I was a teenager. When I got there, she was still conscious, though barely, her hand cool in mine, the hospital room quiet except for the soft, steady sound of machines. Claire was already there, holding her other hand, her face pale and swollen from crying. I leaned close and told her everything I had never said clearly enough over the years, that I forgave her completely, that I finally understood, that the $200 million meant absolutely nothing to me compared to the 3 weeks we had just spent finally knowing each other after a lifetime of not. She squeezed my hand once, weakly, her eyes finding mine, and whispered the same 4 words she had said to me on the phone that October night, the last complete sentence she ever spoke to me. She passed early the next morning, with Claire and me on either side of her bed, holding her hands, the room quiet in a way that no longer felt like the silence I had grown up with on Larch Avenue. The funeral was small, held at a church in Grovemont that my mother had attended sporadically for most of her adult life, more out of habit than devotion. Patricia was there, the same neighbor who had knocked on my mother's door in her house slippers to tell her about the news broadcast. Walter came too, older now, walking with a cane, telling me afterward that my mother had once thanked him, years ago, for teaching me things she said she didn't know how to teach herself. I stood at that funeral surrounded by people from a town I had spent much of my adult life trying to outgrow, and I understood, standing there, that I had never actually outgrown it at all, that everything I had built had grown directly out of the silence and struggle of that small brick house on Larch Avenue, and that the $200 million gift I had once imagined as separate from my mother's story was, in the truest sense, entirely about her. I think about my mother almost every single day now, not the exhausted woman who spent 40 years unable to say 3 simple words, but the woman who found the courage to say them before it was too late. Even if too late meant only 3 weeks instead of a lifetime she and I both deserved. I still drive out to Grovemont sometimes, past the brick house on Larch Avenue, past the lot where Verna's Diner once stood before it closed years ago. And I think about how much of who I became was shaped by a silence I spent my whole life trying to fill with achievement, as if enough success could somehow translate into the words I was actually waiting for. It never could have. I understand that now. What finally changed things wasn't the $200 million, and it wasn't the headlines. It was a diagnosis that forced my mother to stop protecting herself from vulnerability. And it took nearly losing her entirely for me to understand that the version of love she had been offering me all along, in cold coffee and folded laundry and quiet Sunday phone calls, had been real the whole time, even when it didn't sound the way I needed it to sound. The Route 9 Foundation still operates today, funding medical research and supporting working single mothers in towns like Grovemont, exactly as I originally intended. But I added something to it after my mother passed, a small program within the foundation that funds counseling and family communication resources for households like the one I grew up in, families where love exists, but the words for it never quite made it into the open air. I named that program after her, quietly, the way she would have wanted it, without a press release, without headlines. It felt like the right way to honor a woman who spent her life speaking through actions because the words themselves had been taken from her by circumstances far older than either of us. If there is someone in your life whose silence has hurt you, I would gently ask you to consider what I now understand far too late, that love withheld isn't always love absent. Sometimes it is fear wearing the shape of distance, passed down from people who were simply never taught another way to carry it. Don't wait for a headline, a diagnosis, or a hospital hallway to say what matters most to the people you love. Say it now, while there is still time for it to be heard, still time for it to change something between you. My mother taught me that lesson in the cruelest possible way, by waiting until there were only 3 weeks left to say what could have been said across 40 years, and I share her story, now hoping it might spare someone else that same regret. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live through it, let us know in the comments what it made you think of, who it made you want to call today instead of tomorrow. And if you'd like to hear more true stories like this one, stories about the families we come from and the words we spend our whole lives waiting to hear, make sure you're subscribed, because we have many more waiting to be told.